This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Connor Boyack. Connor is the founder and president of the Libertas Institute, a free market think tank that advocates for a more libertarian society. He's also the author of the wildly popular children's book series, The Tuttle Twins, and the co-writer of the new book, Mediocrity, 40 Ways Government Schools Are Failing Today's Students, which he co-wrote with Corey DeAngelis. We will be discussing mediocrity and America's public school system on the show today. Connor, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So the book is fantastic, but before we get into the book, just tell my audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, so I run this think tank you mentioned. I founded it about 11 years ago. We're based in Utah, but we work in state capitals across the country, basically trying to reform laws in a very kind of libertarian fashion. We've changed over 100 laws, probably over 130 or 40 at this point. Bunch of them were first of their kind in the entire country. So we do a lot of kind of innovative, interesting things rather than a lot of the traditional stuff, although we do plenty of that too. So been having just fun trying to be super effective at actually making a difference and changing laws to get the government out of people's lives a little more. Along the way, started writing books. As you mentioned, the Tuttle Twins kind of grew out of that work. We've sold over 5 million copies. We have books from toddlers to teens, all teaching about the ideas of a free society. And now we have a cartoon as well. We're in the second season now of our cartoon. It's available for free on Angel Studios. And what else? I'm a beekeeper. That's my one hobby. I'm a beekeeper. Travel a lot, do a lot of public speaking. Basically, I'm just like a freedom guy, and I shout from the rooftops and on my Twitter profile, like all the things about freedom. But I think where I kind of specialize, you might say, is taking abstract or complex ideas and making them concrete and simple to understand for people. Certainly that's borne out in things like the Tuttle Twins, where we're taking big economic principles and things like this and making it into something a 7-year-old can understand. But even my writing and my advocacy and things for adults, it's, that's kind of my knack, is like, this stuff can be confusing. Most people didn't learn it in school. How do we help people make sense of these things so that they can better understand it and then actualize it in their lives?
Well, your book, Mediocrity, is an excellent example of that because it's very approachable, even for somebody that has no familiarity whatsoever with the public education system. What was it that motivated you and Corey to write Mediocrity?
So that's an interesting question. This was last fall. I was out walking my dogs, and I knew that in April, 6-7 months from then, there was going to be this anniversary that had been on my mind 40 years prior. So April 26, 1983 is when Ronald Reagan's administration put out a report called A Nation at Risk. They called it an open letter to the American people. And in there, they warned that America's foundations, back in 1983, mind you, were being threatened by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatened to overwhelm those institutions, those foundations. And that this was crazy. I thought they said if a foreign government had attempted to impose upon America these very mediocre educational standards and results, we might have viewed it, they said, as an act of war. As it stands, we've allowed this to happen to ourselves. So I've shared this story for, 3-4 years. I do a lot of speaking at homeschool conferences and parents rights type stuff. So I shared this story over the years, and I always ask people at the end, raise your hand if you think things have substantially improved in the education system in the last, since 1983. And no one to date has dared to raise their hand, because I think we all know that the answer is basically nothing has improved. And so last fall, I'm walking the dogs. I'm thinking about this anniversary. I'm like, maybe I should do a book. And then I thought of my friend Corey, who's like Mr. School Choice Influencer. And so I pitched him on the idea. We decided to join up. And then because it was we published it on the exact 40th anniversary of that report coming out this past April 26th. And so we decided to do 40 ways that government schools are failing today's students. So one for every chapter, 40 chapters in the book for the 40 years. That was kind of the shtick. But it was all just to kind of memorialize this report and say, we didn't listen then. We're still not listening. So what does this mean for 5, 10, 20 years from now? What does it mean for the future of our country?
All of the chapters in the book are short, sweet, and to the point. I really love the format of the book. In there, you talk about two of the most important figures in modern American public education, Horace Mann and John Dewey. And in a lot of ways, they are like the architects of our public education system. But a lot of people don't even know who those two figures are. So can you talk to us a little bit about Mann and Dewey and what role they had in shaping the American public education system?
So these are kind of the whipping boys of early American public school system. By no means were they the only ones, but they're great spokespeople and representatives for so many others at the time that were shaping this system. These guys were secular humanists. They were collectivists, atheists, basically. John Dewey once has this quote where he says that teachers are the prophets of the one true God. Now, why would an atheist talk in language like that? Well, his God was literally government. It was the state. And he saw prophets as these, teachers as these ambassadors, these emissaries to spread the kind of civic or statist kind of mindset that they had. Horace Mann was the first commissioner of education in Massachusetts, where many horrible things have always emanated from Massachusetts. Romney Care came from there, which became Obamacare, and gun control and all kinds of stuff, including public schools. So that was where we had the first kind of compulsory schooling law. I don't call it a compulsory education law because you can't compel education. You can compel schooling. So that was Horace Mann who got us started there. He has this quote where he says that men are like cast iron, children are like wax. And he's talking about how it's easy to mold and manipulate children, whereas those adults, let's set them aside and focus on the kids, which, mind you, has been the approach of every massive totalitarian dictator throughout history, Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Castro, and all the rest. So that was Horace Mann, and John Dewey was very similar. These guys were progressives that wanted to architect a schooling system based on the Prussian model. The Prussian model was very authoritarian, very militaristic. They wanted obedient soldiers and servants and citizens. And so these guys they approved of and appealed to that model to say, hey, we need something like this here to create this homogenous representation. Horace Mann in particular, like he's known for this like one schoolroom, one what do they call it? One room school kind of model in the early days. And his big thing was he wanted to take children from the cultural influences of their parents and create one American culture. He didn't like at the time that there were all these, different immigrants and cultures and things. And so he wanted to homogenize, he wanted to standardize. And so the Prussian model, as it emerged, was certainly appealing to these guys as a vehicle to do it. So many other players in the system, obviously, but they're kind of the representatives that we can look to better understand the mentality of these people who built the system that we largely now have today still.
It's been evident for a long time, as you said before, really since the early 1980s, that our public schools are in bad shape. And the government does keep some data on this. They issue an assessment called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Explain to my audience what that is, and what does that tell us about why our schools are falling behind?
So the NAEP scores, as they're called, sometimes it's called the Nation's Report Card. And so if you Google Nation's Report Card, you'll find their website. They do these kind of regular assessments of fourth graders, eighth graders, 12th graders, different subjects, English, and reading, math, and history. And they test different, subjects, different ages. But the whole point is they want to benchmark, and have for many years, benchmark the educational attainment based on testing. I mean, testing is not perfect as a means of measuring education, but it's at least a useful insight to just try and have a understanding of what's going on. I'll give you a recent headline just to capture what's going on here. So it was about 3 weeks ago at the time we're recording this. Headline came out from NAEP, from Nation's Report Card, and they had just computed the results of the eighth grade American history and civic exam administered to eighth graders all over the country. And the result was that only 13% of eighth graders were proficient in American history.
Wow.
That's a massive failing grade. I mean, I was just doing a radio interview yesterday morning with a host out in Chicago. He's got a radio station out there. And so we were talking about the Chicago public schools, and he had pointed out that for Chicago specifically, 0% of the schools there have proficiency levels for reading. Right. And so some school districts and locales are much higher, stronger families, parents are more involved. They're teaching this stuff at home anyways, because the schools aren't teaching it that well. So the credit should really go to the parents. Then you get broken families and a lot of this stuff going on in other cities, and the school system sucks and the parents aren't helping. And so the scores are lower. So it's just an assessment to say, how are things going? And this is why in 1983, they were warning about a rising tide of mediocrity. I mean, 13% proficiency, I wouldn't even call mediocre. I would say that's miserably failing. And so what then is the result of that? If those who don't learn from the past are condemned to repeat it, and if we've got just generations of kids growing up not learning from the past, then what does that mean for the future? It's why everyone's supporting socialism, and they're all social justice warrior leftists, because they don't understand from history the destructive nature of those ideologies and attitudes. And if I'm putting my tinfoil hat on, that's why this 87% of high school teachers support the Democrat Party. 85% of elementary school teachers. So this is conservatives, libertarians. For generations, they've been sending their children to be effectively indoctrinated by their ideological adversaries during the most intellectually formative years of their life. And so ultimately, it's a question of, are we okay with the system or not? And if we're not, what are we going to do about it? Some people try to reform from within. That's awesome. Others say, I'm fleeing Babylon and I'm going to get out of Dodge here and go do something else. Fine. To us, the book is not a pro homeschool book necessarily. It's not a pro private school. We even say in the book, this is not a book about solutions. They are out there. They're easily found. This is a book about problems so that everyone understands the nature of what we're dealing with. Where you go from this, is your own decision. You've got your own life path. That's fine. We're not going to try and recommend or tell you to do anything. But we want to basically red pill as many parents as possible to say, you can't assume that what's happening today is what happened to you back in the 80s when you were growing up. Things are different. Things have changed. We continue to have this decline. It's time to wake up and do something about it.
I can say as a seventh grade social studies teacher, just anecdotally, that is an absolutely accurate characterization of our middle schooler social studies knowledge. Now, I'm lucky enough to be in a school where I have really great social studies colleagues, but because there's been such an emphasis on math and language arts at the elementary school levels, we get students that literally know nothing. They can't even name the 7 continents when they get to seventh grade social studies, and we're expected to teach them about the Middle Ages. So they are falling behind. And one of the things that you point out in your book is that COVID accelerated not only the trend of failing test scores, which, as we've talked about already on this podcast, was something that's been happening for decades and decades now, but also parental dissatisfaction. I think that before COVID, there were a lot of parents that were kind of uneasy about what was happening in the schools. But after COVID, that number is dramatically higher. So what's going on with that? How did COVID contribute to failing test scores and increasing parental dissatisfaction with the public education establishment?
So what I've seen from my perch, having worked with directly thousands of parents, I would say, talking about their children's education through the Tuttle Twins and our policy work at Libertas Institute and everything else. My feeling, if I were to aggregate all those conversations into one summary, is that for decades, right of center parents have assumed the best of the government school as an institution and have felt that, well, I went to public school and I turned out fine, therefore it's okay to send my kids. So what I take away from that is a lack of awareness and a lack of intentionality. It was just that, a lot of these parents are kind of on autopilot. It's just what you do. It's what I did. It's what my parents did. And they're on autopilot. So here comes COVID, and it basically grabs everyone by the shoulders and shakes them a little bit and says, "Hey, pay attention for a minute. Something different's happening." It was a disrupt. It's like when you're. This is going to be a crude example. I'm thinking off shooting from the hip. But imagine you're in a coffee shop, and there's all kinds of noises, and you're able to still sit there and type up a Google Doc or read a book despite all those noises, because your brain your conscious mind is filtering them as normal input, and so it can kind of discard them, and you're able to, a lot of people benefit from listening to white noise and kind of helps them focus, myself included. Well, you're in that coffee shop, there's all this noise, people are ordering, chit-chatting or whatever, and then you hear, a kid scream. Well, that's a pattern interrupt. All of a sudden, everyone, whatever they're doing, is paying attention to that because it's not normal. So our minds filter out the status quo. They filter out the normal because our conscious mind, if you look at the neuroscience behind this, your brain is literally trying to preserve calories because it consumes a lot of energy. And so to preserve calories, it does a whole number of things, including filtering out white noise, essentially, we might call it. So I would say that for decades, parents, for them, the public schools was white noise. It was normal. It's what you do. No big deal. Kids will turn out fine, blah, blah, blah. COVID then became the pattern interrupt. It was the kid shouting in the Starbucks to say, hey, pay attention to this. All of a sudden, you need to now apply your conscious mind to what's going on, which meant that parents were now, watching some of the Zoom calls their kids were on. They were paying attention to, the last homework that they were sent home with. They were reviewing their books together to say, okay, let me now be your teacher and kind of keep you going over the next few weeks. They were saying, oh man, okay, I'm homeschooling now, at least for a few weeks because the schools are shut down. What do I do? And how do I do this? And let's start from understanding what you have been learning. Holy crap, you've been learning that, and it was just the pivot requiring millions of parents to apply their conscious, observations to what was going on. Many parents, despite that, felt comfortable with what their kids were learning, and they grit their teeth for 2, 3, 4 weeks to homeschool until that was over and schools in their location reopened, or we were into summer of 2020. But it was just it was this sudden experiment that was foisted on everybody that required them to step out of their status quo. I hope we don't have another pandemic or anything like that, but my heavens, was that not an effective means of waking up a lot of people? So for me, like I try and think of that from like a marketing standpoint. How can we create safe pattern interrupts to get people to actually pay attention? In part, that's what this book Mediocrity is like hoping to do, is to say like, hey, let's bombard you with so many examples of things so that you're kind of like, oh crap, I better pay attention to this. Maybe I need to check my assumptions.
If ever there was a time for a book like this, this is definitely it. And I can say again, just from my experience, there are a lot of parents that are willing to ask hard questions now that would not have in 2019, because the whole COVID situation was an absolute disaster for public schools. And you highlight in your book just several relevant issues that are going on in public education today. And so I want to walk through some of those. Now, I'm lucky enough to teach in deep red Kentucky. So our state legislature has been very slow to allow any kind of like progressive political policy agendas to work their way into the classroom, but it's still there, even in a state that's as red as Kentucky, the politicization of our schools. And you guys talk in a couple of chapters about this increasing politicization, that our schools are becoming more and more indoctrinators of particular political agendas. So how has this focus on politicization, especially in states like California and Illinois and New York, how have they impacted the quality of our schools' educational outputs?
Well, part of the challenge, and I don't know if this matches your experience, but a lot of the teacher training colleges, where these students are learning how to teach, they're not becoming subject matter experts in anything. They're learning pedagogy, they're learning classroom management, they're learning discipline, and just how to manage a bunch of kids and conduct a class, not how to inspire them and how to unleash their creativity and how to honor their individuality and let them learn things that matter to them, and so the challenge is that I think of it like this with the police. Think of what's going on in the police right now. Across the country, police forces are having a hard time recruiting people because certainly with COVID, but long before that, there's a lot. I would say the good cops often get fed up with the bureaucracy. They get fed up sometimes with the corruption. And so I know many officers who have gotten frustrated and quit. So when the so-called good officers who are trying to do the right thing and the noble thing and all the things, when they leave, it increases the concentration within the existing police force of what I might say are bad cops, the very people we don't want wielding a gun and potentially shooting someone that they shouldn't. I think there's a similar situation going on in the government schools as well. When when more freedom-minded people tend to bristle against the bureaucratic nature of the government schools. There's certainly exceptions. I'm sure you're one of them. But largely speaking, these people tend to remove themselves from consideration for employment in a system like that, and which is why 87% of high school students are, supporting the Democrats and they're on the left. These are people who are attracted to authority. They're attracted to these positions of being of ideological influence. Too many teachers are not educators; they're just activists. They see this as an opportunity to push their ideas, and they make it about them rather than their students. So the challenge is, like, education. Ultimately, it's never unbiased. I mean, journalism, it's never unbiased. Sometimes people might hide their biases really well, but every educator has a bias. They have a political perspective. They have a worldview that helps them understand what's going on. And so the challenge as a parent in sending your child to that student is you're necessarily subjecting your children to the influence of people whose values you might disagree with, who have worldviews that they're going to just like sprinkle in. Like you saying you're in Kentucky, I'm in Utah, deep red states. And yet, like when our legislature said no to critical race theory and all the rest, right? There was this, I can't remember the organization, but they did one of their undercover things, and they were in talking to some of these school district people who were openly laughing and saying, oh yeah, we just call it something else and do what we want, right? Because these people are largely leftist. So even in red states, you tend to get these pockets of more left-oriented people who want to push these types of agendas. Ultimately, again, it's not so much anti-public school or pro-homeschool or whatever. It's a plea for intentionality. It's a call to action to say, look, if public school is right for you, great, but you have to have eyes wide open. You have to know what you're up against. You have to know what you're signing up for and what you need to counteract in your own home, right? If anything, you're going to put in more effort, perhaps, as a public school parent who does it right because of the intentionality in the home that you need to make sure, hey, what are you learning? Let's go over that. Let's talk about that. Let's supplement what you're not learning. Let's correct that crazy teacher who says that recycling is important to save the world and, blah, 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 right? Whereas a homeschool parent, maybe you're using a curriculum you trust. It's more laid back. It's child-led learning. It's, at the end of the day, it's just intentionality. However you're going to educate your children, you got to recognize, I think we're in a mind war. Our children's minds are ground zero in a psychological battlefield where they're trying to be impressed upon by activist teachers, by TikTok influencers, by corporations and all the rest. We need intentionality. We need parents to wake up, and whatever path they're going to follow in terms of the education of their children, they have to do it with eyes wide open. They have to understand the threats that exist around us, which is why ultimately for us, the book is kind of more of just a wake up call to say, hey, here's what's going on. Now you need to decide what you're going to do about it.
One of the biggest mistakes that parents make is that they think that their principals or that their local school board makes all of the educational decisions for their children, but that's not the case. In a lot of cases, really, states drive education policy, but even beyond that, the federal Department of Education is much more powerful than many people realize. So, could you explain to my audience how the public school bureaucracy works, what kind of power the federal Department of Education has, and how that impacts students at our local schools?
I would say there's two ways that these national efforts reach down into our local communities. The first is with things like the Department of Education. What they are in particular good at is bribing states into compliance. Think back to things like Common Core, right? It's like, here's all this money, and if you want it, you need to apply, and you're going to change all these things and do it, So they dangle all this money out there, and so they don't require, they don't compel. There's no federal law that says thou shalt pass Common Core in your state or whatever. What they instead do is they effectively bribe schools, and of course, everyone in the schools, it's always, we need more money. It's always we're underfunded, and so they in exchange for a relatively small amount of money compared to their overall budget in the state, they accept that funding with massive strings attached and let the tail wag the dog. So that's number one, is primarily through bribing states and school districts into compliance with what these central planners create. But the other thing is, I would say it's more the national conferences. It's the teachers unions. It's these kind of non-governmental commissions and organizations. Even with Common Core, it was the Bill Gates of the world and others kind of getting together and forming whatever it was called, It's some nonprofit they set up that was the group that got together and created the standards, that the federal government came in and bribed, states to push through. So you get these like conglomerates and these associations and these teachers unions and others who say, this is what we think ought to be done. And then all the members of those organizations, all the people who are part of the teachers union and they've, voted for that resolution at the convention, they come home and they become local advocates for that. Or if they're in a position of influence, if they're the principal, or if they're even a teacher in their classroom, they'll just begin to, within whatever power they have, start to implement these things. And so you definitely, it's not enough to say, oh, we live in a conservative community and we have a conservative school board. I mean, even think of even like textbooks. You can be in the deepest red city in red Kentucky, and you could have a totally conservative school board, and yet they are using the textbooks that were manufactured for California markets that are then spread across the country. And suddenly the curriculum that's being used in a lot of these classrooms is not necessarily in line with the values of your supposedly conservative school board. So you still get all these disconnects, which again just takes us back to the intentionality. You can't assume the best. You can't think that you can't give them the benefit of the doubt. You have to assume that there's these nefarious efforts afoot to try and push agendas, because frankly there are.
As libertarians, we love to give George W. Bush a really hard time for starting the disastrous wars on terror. But another major bill that he signed into law was No Child Left Behind. And that's been the driving force behind much of our 21st century education policy. So could you explain No Child Left Behind and the way that that has impacted our schools over the last 20 years?
I think No Child Left Behind, as with many initiatives, started from a good place, a good intention. And that intention was, we don't want children left behind. We want to make sure that kids who are falling behind can catch up. We want to make sure to level the playing field. We want to, so I think the intentions are good. I want to at least give a measure of grace to the people who were initially concocting this idea. So then largely the path that they went down is optimizing around standardized tests. We need to gather data in order to better understand how things are working, because you can't improve what you cannot measure. And anyone in business will tell you the same thing. You need to know what your KPIs are, and you need to know, what your important metrics are, so that you can then optimize for those, track them, and then improve. Again, I think that's a fine thing in the abstract, that yes, we need to measure so that we can improve. So No Child Left Behind really foisted this regime of heavy standardized testing. It's, right around when we get that NAEP score that you're talking about, because now all these schools are having to do all the standardized testing. It was really optimized, as you pointed out, around very specific subjects, to the exclusion of others. And so all these schools then have to pivot and say, okay, we're leaning in heavily into STEM, and we're going to focus narrowly on these, subjects, because this is what we're being tested on. Well, the problem is human behavior, right? We respond to incentives. So now there's all these teachers who know that their school is being graded, or they themselves are being evaluated based on the assessment performance. I'll give you a very specific example of how this goes kind of weird and crazy. This is not a unique story, but in Utah, I'm aware of several cases. One I'll mention where the teacher bribed her students to perform well on the test, offering candy and pizza parties and all these things, trying to bribe them and give out prizes and whatever if they didn't opt out of the test, and if they took it, and if they did well. And the teacher's responding to the pressure that she was under, because part of her evaluation and then her whole school district, or her whole school's grade, is based off of how well the testing is going. So when you, in a business, when you optimize on a KPI, it's because that is the most important, or one of the most important measurements. And man, if I am measuring the number of sales calls that my business makes, there's no problem if we make 400 sales calls as opposed to 200. That's a good thing, because it's going to net more revenue, so that we can, there's no real downsides towards improvement in that metric. But over here with the schools and with No Child Left Behind, when it's, hey, you need to get good scores on your math exams, so that we can then punish and redo the schools that are failing, and try and reconstitute them, and shut them down and do something different. When the teachers start responding to those metrics, there's huge downsides, because they're excluding other subjects. They're bribing the kids, which, they're getting in, I would say, inappropriate behavior. They're teaching to the test, right? The output of the exam becomes kind of the primary focus of the teacher, rather than this broad base of knowledge and rounder kind of character building of the individual. And so it takes education from this like beautiful tapestry of interwoven threads that make us who we are, and it reduces it to this narrow set of test scores that teachers are optimizing for, to the exclusion or minimization of other things. So again, I think the intent is fine. But the execution and the way No Child Left Behind worked, it left behind plenty of kids. It's like the Patriot Act, right? That was not about patriotism. They name these things that ultimately don't pan out. So I would say the key legacy of No Child Left Behind ultimately is the heavy reliance on standardized testing within schools. And again, it can be useful in a certain extent, where I can then say on your podcast that only 13% of eighth graders are proficient in history. That's a useful talking point. It's a useful kind of light assessment of how the overall school system is doing. But in a very kind of real world, practical boots on the ground effect, I think it creates a lot of problems in the classroom when you get these, I'll call them lazy teachers, who are teaching to the test and optimizing for the test, rather than saying, I'm going to focus on this broader education of my children, let the scores fall where they may, and we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, and I know in the state of Kentucky, that's completely true. And one of the reasons why I have kids that come to my class, they can't even locate our state on a map or don't know anything about the three branches of government, is that in elementary school, all of the effort and energy is put into increasing those math and language arts scores. So that's what they spend their time doing. And so we have kids that might go weeks and weeks on end in elementary school without ever learning any social studies content at all. It's almost like it's an elective or an extracurricular class at the elementary school level. And even the way that our standardized tests are designed, like if you look at our state's eighth grade social studies common assessment, it's not a social studies test, it's a reading test using social studies content. So even within that social studies standardized test that every student in the state of Kentucky takes, it's not like it doesn't really test that content. It's about how well you can read a particular passage based on the metrics that the state uses to determine high quality reading. And that leads into another claim that you guys make in your book, is that the school curriculum, especially as it stands after No Child Left Behind, does not help our students become critical thinkers, and it doesn't prepare our kids for a career or for college. So can you walk us through that claim? Like why is it that it just fails them to become better thinkers, and it doesn't set them up well for what they're going to do when they graduate high school?
Well, one of the big things that Common Core promised was focusing K-12 on making children, quote, college and career ready. That was the big mantra, the umbrella term under which all of the reforms were packaged. We got to prepare them for college and a career. Of course, that's been horribly miserable. We share in the book the statistic. I don't quite remember it off the top of my head, but it was like in 2-year colleges and academies, it's like, gosh, I'm not even going to try and say a number because I'll mess it up, but a huge number. I think it was like 40% of freshmen in these 2-year associates kind of programs. 40% of them have to go through remedial classes, which means they're taking high school classes, still in college. And then in the 4-year universities, the remedial percentage was about 20%. Now it's coming back to me. So it's about half of what you get in the 2-year universities, but still a fifth of the students who are going to college are still not ready for college. Universities are spending, I think the annual sum was about $7 billion just in the remedial education of these high school kids. So clearly it's showing this breakdown in K through 12 that despite all these reforms and all this money trying to make them college and career ready, they are not. These kids are largely churning out as ignoramuses. They're apathetic. They don't know what they want to do. They don't have any practical skills. There was an amazing survey. I don't think we included this in the book because I'm pretty sure it came out after. It was just a few months ago. I don't remember the name of it, unfortunately. It was this big, huge survey. They interviewed like 50,000 parents, and they asked them to evaluate all the reasons why they feel that K through 12 education is important. And there were like, 40 or 50 criteria. And it was really interesting how they conducted the survey. They asked the adult, the parent, how do you prioritize this particular criteria, 1 through 50, let's say. And then they also asked them for each of those criteria, they asked them, how do you think that society, that everyone else prioritizes that particular thing? So college and career ready, back to our example, I think as I recall, people said that society ranks that it was number 2 or number 3, right? Because it's been drilled in our heads. This is why we have K-12 education. So they were saying, hey, this is super important. Parents for themselves, they ranked it like number 46 or something like this. It was near the bottom. Parents were saying, that's not why I'm sending my kid to K-12 school. I want them to learn these fundamentals or whatever. So the question is, what rose to the top? The top 2 things that all these parents, the very statistically significant survey, they went above and beyond and talking to more than you would need to be statistically significant. What they found is the top most goal of parents for K-12 education was practical skills. They want their kids to actually know how to do stuff, to be competent people. And number 2 was critical thinking. So they want them to be competent, critical thinkers. And so to your question, I guess, I might say kind of snidely that I think the answer is self-evident as to why schools are not developing critical thinking and, helping kids, be ready for careers and stuff. But if I were to dig into that more than just a snide, dismissive remark, I might say that, again, when you optimize for these tests and when you focus on the memorization and regurgitation of information, it deprives you of broader, deeper learning that can't be so easily measured and assessed. I remember, I went to public school back in California. I grew up in San Diego. And I remember taking things like home ec, and these different things, woodworking and all these kind of practical things, like a computer course, a photography, like just lots of stuff, which is great to have those electives. But there's clearly a disconnect because parents themselves are recognizing that their children are not truly prepared for college and career. Even college students are often not prepared for careers, which is why so many of them end up working at Starbucks despite having, degrees to nowhere. But then also that, the critical thinking, you watch any of these like jaywalking type thing, man on the street videos where people are being interviewed. Like it's just every poll out there shows that people are gullible, they're ignorant, and it's just a sad state of society that we've fallen into. So the school system, I would say, fundamentally, I would say this: we can't rely on a government school system to teach us the many problems about the government, right? No government-controlled curriculum is going to talk about other perspectives that are unflattering to the government's narrative of its own history and positions. So if we truly want to develop critical thinking, I don't think that we can rely on an institution whose owners and controllers ultimately don't want critical thinkers. Those in power don't want independent-minded, entrepreneurial critical thinkers. Those people, as Ayn Rand once wrote, those people can't be ruled. I think it was in Atlas Shrugged. She says, we don't want a bunch of Boy Scouts. We want a bunch of criminals because we can rule over these ignorant people and make so many things a law that we can then, control all these people. So those in power want a dumbed down population. They benefit from it because the populace won't know what they're doing. They won't learn from history to stop them from repeating it in the future. They're not going to be civically engaged. They're not going to know what their rights are. Therefore, they can't defend. Like if I'm an authoritarian, dictator, I don't want an educated, independent-minded, critically thinking populace. I want a submissive one. And so, again, there are pockets of reform. I think of the John Taylor Gattos of the world and others, or yourself, right? There's certainly ways within the system to try and help as many people as we can. But sometimes you need like Neo to just, leave the matrix and start, pulling as many people out to fight the machines. It's kind of this broad war. And I guess for me, we got to throw mud against the wall, see what sticks. There's approaches within the system. There's approaches without the system. We got to try everything to save as many kids as we can.
It's frustrating because the public school system really requires us as teachers to cater to the lowest common denominator. So they're creating the situation where kids are very far behind grade level, and we have to teach to those kids that don't have the baseline skills they need to be successful. Meanwhile, I have several really bright students that are really curious and really interested, and we just can't cater to them. So in your book, you guys talk about how the public school system really holds back gifted and advanced students. So what is it about our system that holds those kids that want to learn and that want to grow and that want to develop back?
I would say primarily it's a matter of teacher attention and focus. When the teachers know, especially if they're being evaluated based on performance and test scores and things, when they know that the bright kids are going to do just fine on the tests, right? They're going to go focus on the kids who are struggling, and they should, but this is the nature. This is the problem when you collect a whole bunch of kids together and they're all at different, stages in life. And the only thing that they have in common is the period of time at which they exited their mother's birth canal. Like the fact that we combine all these kids, like, oh, you're the same age, therefore let's throw you all in a room, right? You get these wildly different interests and capabilities and everything. So the teacher is like, oh, well, if I'm going to be evaluated based on performance of tests, I need to bring up the kids at the bottom so that the average is higher. And those kids at the top, they'll do just fine. So in most schools, we don't have a system of child-led learning or this kind of incremental approach for kids to go at their own speed ahead of the class, ahead of the teacher. We have this very kind of measured, regimented curriculum that keeps everyone going at the same pace, which means that the kids in the middle are doing okay with that pace. The teacher's focused on the kids who are behind to try and keep them up with the pace. But the kids at the top who can fill it out quickly or read the book fast or get an A on the exam, they're bored and they start to loathe learning. They start to loathe school. I was in the gifted program when I was a kid. I hated school. I hated learning because I just found it all irrelevant and boring. I wasn't challenged. I wasn't allowed to just kind of follow my own path and unleash, the innate creativities and curiosities I had. And so I started to despise school because I felt it was a waste of time. I didn't enjoy it. And that to me is the detriment that you get when you have these gifted kids who want to excel, but the system is just not built up in a way to let them move ahead at their own pace. I mean, there's experiments, there's systems. I'm not saying like categorically there's nothing, but even gifted programs I think are insufficient. Many schools across the country have shut their gifted programs down, especially in blue states, because we don't want to make the kids who are falling behind feel bad. Therefore, let's suppress everyone to this like lowest common denominator. It's just a travesty. So I think that's why you see a lot of the like amazing entrepreneurs in our society all struggled with school. It's just not built in a way to for like high performing, high achieving, curious ADHD type kids who just want to go to the beat of their own drum. And so to me, the operative question is, how can we build a system, or what would it look like to have educational systems that allow people to go at their own speed and have a more individualized education? I'll say this, and I because I think it would be tantalizing to mention this. Saul Khan, the creator of Khan Academy, Khan, very popular math website. They're developing an AI called Conmigo, which is a play off of the Spanish conmigo, which means with me. So there's this Conmigo. And they're taking AI. He gave this TED Talk. So you can Google, or if you have show notes, maybe you can find and link to this. He did a TED Talk just a few weeks ago. It was amazing, about AI in education. And he says, look, everyone's freaking out about ChatGPT because their students are just going there and saying, type me an essay on the Articles of Confederation. And then they turn it in. And the teachers don't like that. Rightly so. But he said, AI actually presents the most transformative opportunity we've ever had to provide individualized instruction on the par with a one-on-one tutor. When you look, he says, at all the aristocratic societies throughout world history, and all those kids who are getting private tutors so that they're becoming massively educated and very intellectual and capable, they had a tutor sitting by their side to give them individualized instruction. So the AI that they're building, it's this iterative AI. It's not just going to give you your whole essay. It's going to say, okay, you got to type an essay, write an essay about Articles of Confederation. How do you think we should start? And then the kid might say, what if we talk about the colonies and how they had different governments? The AI might say, oh, hey, that's a great example. How about you write the first sentence and then I'll write the second one? And so the kid will sit there and type up the first sentence. The AI can type in the next one. And then the AI might say, hey, what do you think about what I wrote? Should we change it at all? Or what do you think? Oh, the kid might say, I actually like this, so now they're like engaged in a conversation, but they're having to do a lot of the work in this very iterative fashion, kind of in the chat model of that level of interaction. So I think I am optimistic when it comes to education in the future, because I think the rise in homeschooling is a good thing for society as a whole. I think the rise in micro schools, what used to be called pandemic pods and things like this, there's just micro schools being unleashed all over the place, where teachers are leaving the bureaucracy and starting their own little school to educate 10, 12 kids and make more money and have less bureaucracy and more time and everything else. So we got tons of micro schools. And then I think AI and these technologies are going to basically apply so much pressure to the public school system, competitive, innovative pressure, that I think we're going to see these new models and opportunities emerging where it's just going to have to be dealt with. It's going to force a conversation. And I think it's a positive one to say, what truly is education and how can we weave in these technologies and approaches to support the individual? Like after this call, I'm going to pull up my phone and tap a button and food is going to show up at my office. I'm going to use DoorDash for my lunch. And it's going to be what I want from the restaurant I want, when I want, how I want, right? Like we're in this economy with technology where we can individualize everything. And to me, we have to do that. It's a very libertarian ethos. We have to speak to the individual, including with education. And so the reason why these gifted kids and everyone falls behind is because we're treating them as a collective. And in the collective, the individual's interests get suppressed. We have to correct for that. I think AI and technology can actually present one of the better opportunities we've ever had to try and get at that in education.
Behavior is such a massive problem in the classroom, and you guys highlight that in your book. I'm very fortunate to work at a school where we have a great administration that does a good job of dealing with student behaviors, but I know that as a teacher, like I have complete control of my classroom, but I really have to think about how all of my lessons are going to facilitate that kind of control over my student behaviors. And so you wind up spending a lot of time like creating these routines and procedures and not actually instructing kids on the content that they're supposed to learn. Why are behavioral problems so out of control, and how does that contribute to what you guys call kind of like a toxic social environment in the schools?
There's a lot of things to say here. I'm just going to pick on one, and I think it's the breakdown in the family. So much of what we do in the legal space or what we do in the schools is putting band-aids on gangrenous, festering wounds, and that can only go so far. A teacher can only do so much with a kid who's being abused at home or neglected or whatever, right? Or, dad is gone and the kid's got all kinds of trauma and, mom is working 2 jobs. And so the kid is being a latchkey kid, raised by, TikTok and whatever. So to me, so much of our, like, I don't think we're going to save our country at the Capitol. I don't think we're going to save our country in the courtroom. If we're going to save our country, I think it's at the dinner table. I think we have to rebuild social fabric. I think we need to revitalize the family, the nuclear family as the basic social unit of society. Because as any teacher will attest, the more parents are aware and involved and a part of their children's education, the better they do. And so many of the behavioral problems that teachers deal with as disciplinarians are really just outgrowths of what the kids are dealing with at home. That can only go so far. Teachers can only do so much. They're handcuffed in how much discipline they can actually, reasonably administer. And I think rightly so. I think ultimately teachers shouldn't be parents, but that means parents have to be parents. And when they're not, it just creates this downstream effect of problems that you get to deal with in your classroom. I get to deal with up at the Capitol, fighting to change all these laws that were created because people are basically adult infants not taking care of themselves. It has to start with the family, which is why I think a lot of our efforts as libertarians have to be family centric. Too often we talk to adults about themselves and their interests, but gosh, like use the Tuttle twins as an example. When I can go to a family and say, let me help you teach your kids about how money works or why entrepreneurship is important, whatever, I'm teaching those adults, those parents, as much as I'm teaching the kids. Over half of the parents who read our books tell us that they're learning new things for the first time. And so we're reaching whole families and we're engaging them in deeper conversations about current events and what's going on and what's the government doing. And let's be skeptical of, what they're claiming. It has to be family focused. And I think everything else is band-aids. We need to do it. Sometimes you have to cobble together with some duct tape and keep this broken system together as long as you can. But it's not sustainable, which is why I think we have to. Henry David Thoreau, he has this quote where he says, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's only one striking at the root. I want to be a root striker. I want to have conversations around what's the root that we need to strike and not be hacking at the branches of all the problems. Let's focus on those core fundamentals. And I think the family is the core fundamental here that we should be talking about.
Kentucky is a right to work state, so we do not have to participate in the public sector unions at all. So as a teacher, I'm not a member of the union and I don't have to be. A lot of the teachers that I know are members of unions because the unions do offer protection from certain capricious people within the community that want to sue them. And even a lot of the union reps that I know are really good people that are really concerned about the well-being of the teachers. And that all makes sense. I understand their intentions, but the teachers unions are a massive problem. And they're really, I think, one of the biggest pieces of this puzzle here. So talk to us about the role that teachers unions play in the mediocrity of our public schools.
Teachers' unions, like any union, are designed to look after the interests of their members. So they use children, students, as a political prop through which to advance the goals and agendas of their constituent members, which are the teachers. Several teachers' union national officials over the decades have admitted this, sometimes awkwardly and publicly, because it's kind of this unstated, quiet thing. It's all, for them, it's all about think of the children and we got to help kids. But at the end of the day, it's about them acquiring more money and more power. They spend tons of money on elections. They bankroll the Democrat Party. They're a creation of Jimmy Carter, the U.S. Department of Education was. They were working in cahoots with him, and boast that NEA boasts that they created the Department of Education, and so they wield a lot of political power. It's a very leftist because of the makeup of these teachers as a whole. I think it's like 95% plus or whatever of these active members and activists are on the left. And so they are political institutions. They wield political power, even if you're in a state where it's not compelled to join, like in Utah, right? We're also a right to work state. We don't have compulsory unions or anything like that, but the teachers union is here, and it's always about think of the children and it's all about the kids, but ultimately they're trying to boost their own salaries. They're trying to not be accountable for the quality of their own work. They just want to protect their little fiefdoms. And fundamentally, it's because the government school system is a monopoly. I would say it's a quasi monopoly. You can leave. It's not like everyone's compelled to go there, thankfully, but it's effectively a quasi monopoly. And so now what we're seeing many states, my co-author Corey especially is big in this battlefield, pushing for like education savings accounts and other models where parents can take the money that taxpayers had allocated for their children, and instead of that money flowing to the government school, it goes to a private school, their home school curriculum, whatever. I think we're going to see, when there's competition, when the government schools have to actually earn their keep and attract customers, it creates a different mindset. And suddenly you start thinking about customer service rather than take it or leave it. And this is how we are. So teachers unions, fundamentally, they're a political institution. They're very left dominated, and they use children as props to push for the agendas of their adult teacher members.
I completely agree that competition is going to be a key. It's going to be instrumental in trying to undo these problems that we've created in our school systems. What else needs to happen in order to make our public schools better?
Oh boy, do we have another couple hours to? No, just kidding. Let me just say this is a meta level. This will simplify the answer. I don't know. I've got ideas, but what I do know is needed is competition. Like any monopoly, the costs go up, the quality goes down. When you have a competitive market, costs go down, quality goes up. And so to me, I want to see a flourishing landscape of competing, unique education providers. You could have religious schools, you could have schools specializing in autism, you could have schools specializing in kids who are struggling in math, you could have this decentralized network of like co-ops where parents can drop their kids off. So it's kind of like a school, but it's more free, and you could have more unschooling approaches like Sudbury School, where they're more of like, unschooling. Like, let's open up a landscape of diverse options. Just like, again, when I order lunch here in a minute, I don't want to eat at the same cafeteria all the time, whatever some, government program, like Michelle Obama, when she was doing her big food program in the schools and saying, this is what you're going to have to, like, I don't want to be compelled to pick what someone else is picking for me. I want to pick the restaurant I want, the type of food I want, the actual specific meal I want. I think we need to get there with education. I think technology is going to help. I think ESAs are going to help. And so to your question about what do we need to improve, I want to leave that up to the market. But that means we need a market. We need that competitive pressure on the school system. We need parents to be able to easily exit the system when they want and take the money that taxpayers have already agreed to invest for their kids and use it elsewhere. And when we have a competitive landscape, we're going to see the kind of decentralization of education. We're going to see education entrepreneurs coming out of the woodwork with innovative ideas I haven't even thought of and couldn't tell you right now. But if we don't unleash them, if we don't provide them a market in which to offer their services, we're not going to benefit from them. I think we need a market. I think then we will see the good ideas rise to the top, and we're going to see some healthy competitive pressure on the government schools so that they will be kind of compelled to improve far faster than they will if we just go to the state legislature and pass a law trying to force them to do something.
Totally agree. Besides reading your book, what other resources would you suggest to parents who want to know more about how our public schools operate?
The landmark book for me as a graduate of what I call the public fool system is John Taylor Gatto's book, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education. When I read that book, 15 years ago, I was like, oh my gosh, this is everything I struggled with as a student. This, John Taylor Gatto, for those who don't know, very briefly, 30-year teacher in New York in the public school system. He won New York City Teacher of the Year, New York State Teacher of the Year. And he was trying to work from within until ultimately he quit and went on a public speaking tour and wrote books. So I would say that book, number one. Another one that I really heartily recommend all parents read is a book called Free to Play by Peter Gray, Free to Learn by Peter Gray. And it's all about how children learn through play and how they need that as an inherent model of their learning so that they can mimic the adults that they're trying to learn from. So that's one of the top books that I recommend. And then the other one, I always point people to Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talks. He passed away a few years ago, but he has some of the most popular TED Talks on education. One of the things I love about him is he talks about how education can't be a mechanical systems process, taking raw materials and batching them and conforming them like Horace Mann and John Dewey and others wanted to do coming out of the progressive era, the industrial era. They saw children as widgets to be, manipulated. Sir Ken Robinson says, no, it's not a mechanical process. It's an organic process. And all you need to do like a farmer is provide the resources that will allow that child to naturally flourish. It has its own DNA, its own path, its own curiosities. We should be talking about providing the right resources rather than manipulating it and shaping it into what we want. So he's got a lot of very thought-provoking thoughts on education I think would be good for parents to check out as well.
All right. Before we wrap up today, give us the final sales pitch. Why should people buy Mediocrity?
Buy and read Mediocrity. Don't just let it gather dust. More importantly, read Mediocrity. If you went to public school, if your kids are going to public school, if your nieces and nephews are going to public school, if you've got any public school teachers or administrators in your family, or if you're, a breathing, functioning human who has any care about the children in our society and what the future of our country is going to look like. So if any of those apply to you, I would say Mediocrity would be important just so that you fully understand the nature of the problem. Again, we're not here to push a solution on anyone. We're not here to say, therefore you must, go to private school or do homeschool. But we can't, as a society, talk about the right solutions and the right systems if we don't have an agreement and an understanding of the problems. So if you think, oh, things are fine, oh, it's no big deal, if you feel prepared to take that red pill and better understand what's actually happening in today's schools and what that means for the future of our country, get and read the book.
Well, Connor Boyack, this has been an incredible conversation. Before I let you go, tell my audience where they can find your work.
So Mediocrity, you can just head to Amazon and buy it there. I've got a whole bunch of other books. Tuttle Twins is at TuttleTwins.com. If you're curious about our policy work, that's at libertas.org. I'm at ConnorBoyack.com and across social media. You can follow me on Twitter, where I've been having a lot of fun on Twitter 2.0 post Elon. It's been a lot more enjoyable. So come join me there, and just appreciate being able to come on and chat with you.
All right. Well, Connor, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.